Hello everybody, this is Jeremiah Compton G for EDCI 575, and I know you can't see me too well right now, but I just wanted to step out and show you where I am, so it's a little bit different than Montana. At any rate, I'm in Arizona right now at the Instructional Technology Council Conference, and it's a little bit loud out here in the patio, so I'm going to go inside. That way you can hear me a bit better. There's a big huge fountain outside the door, so it kind of complicates being able to talk. I want to do my video recap right now, and I'm traveling, as I said, so that means that I have to do this all in one shot without any editing, because I didn't bring any editing software with me, just using the iPad. So you get to have the bloopers mixed in with the real stuff this time, rather than me editing them out. I've been thinking about making a blooper reel, but I don't know. So at any rate, let me start with the recap. I'd like to begin actually with some reflection on the week and what I saw in the discussion boards. I'm going to try to not speak terribly quickly, as I'm prone to doing, but I have a lot I want to say, so I'm also at the same time trying to balance making this video not terribly long. First of all, I have to say, wow. Just wow. I was totally blown away by the boards this week. You all have definitely exhausted this topic that we had during the last week, and you've impressed me by the huge variety of assessment tools that you've used. I gave one project, and there were a multitude of ways that you went about going to assess my competence in this course for our midterm evaluation. I want to point out a couple different things in terms of the tools that you used, and basically do an extreme comparison. First of all, on one hand, we had rubrics that some people had generated, and those rubrics, some of the softwares that folks use, they complained that they were clunky or clumsy, and that they took an awful lot of time to generate the rubric and use the rubric. But then on the other hand, we had a couple folks use Google Forms, and they said, you know, this took me 10 minutes from start to finish. Or I had one person say, the particular survey that I used took me less time to complete the entire project than it did for the other software I was trying to use to even download onto my computer. So I would encourage you strongly to go back through the midterm evaluation posts that your classmates have made if you haven't done so already, and just look for that one concept, ease of use. And you'll see the huge variety that there was in terms of ease of use. And you'll see that there is a benefit to using some things that are more complicated in terms of the rubrics, because they're incredibly specific with the gradations of performance criteria. But there's that trade-off, of course, with the amount of time that's invested into it. You know, I set pretty broad parameters for this. I didn't tell you to use a particular software, and that's why, because I wasn't in the position to force you into something. I wanted to see what you could come up with. Another thing that I want to reflect on a little bit is just my own, how do I say it? Not competence necessarily, but maybe my own, I'm really struggling for the word here. I guess, well, this is what I wrote down in my notes. That's probably the best way to do this. I wrote down, oh my gosh, geez, oh Pete, do I penalize people for not following instructions? That's like verbatim what I wrote. The reason why I wrote that is because there were specific prompts that I gave you that was pretty much the parameter that I gave you, but not everybody used those prompts. And I also gave you the instruction to use a scale of 1 to 5, and not everybody used that scale. So then here I am as an instructor with this question of, what do I do? Do I take points off because people didn't catch that, or was there something in my instructions, something that I said in the video that perhaps wasn't very clear or wasn't direct enough. These are the questions that we ask ourselves when we look at student work. So at the end of the day, I decide not to penalize people per se because of the fact that this was a pretty broad assignment, and because of the fact that I didn't necessarily repeat the instructions multiple times in multiple ways for people with different learning styles. So I put some of the onus back on myself in that regard as well. The other thing that I've been struggling with this week is this question of expectations. Should I expect more from some students than from others? And let me be really direct with this so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. For example, in this class we have two people that work in IT, and not just in IT, but in e-learning in IT. So should I expect more out of them than I do for somebody who is taking their very first online class? Because we have that broad of a spectrum in this class. And I'm still not sure. This goes back to the issue of bias, which is why I'm reflecting. I would like to do that in front of students because they can see how uncomfortable it is to reflect on your own instruction. I also like to do that in front of students because it is part of our conceptual framework in the College of Education at Montana State University in Billings. Our conceptual framework is that teaching is a reflective practice. So you're not improving your teaching if you're not reflecting. And reflection doesn't necessarily mean that you come up with an answer. For example, I don't have an answer for this, but I do know that it's something that I need to think about. At the end of the day, what do? I go by the rubric that we've created, and I try to be as objective as possible and limit my subjectivity and my bias and what I know about students already, and essentially try to go just with what the evidence tells me. So we'll see how I do. I appreciate any feedback that you have on that. So feel free to open up a conversation on the discussion board about that. The other thing that I've been thinking about is whether or not students expect me to be perfect. And this, if you're a teacher, maybe you've had this same hang up as well. People, when they are students, sometimes I think expect the teacher to have their act together 100% of the time and have everything laid out perfectly and essentially not be human in that regard. I mean, teachers are still human. We still make mistakes. So if I make a mistake, for example, if I don't explain something clearly and I see that 3 or 4 people didn't necessarily follow the instructions, what do I do? Have I just made a fool out of myself in front of class? I'm not sure. I had a big problem with this last semester. It was the first semester that I taught at Montana State University in Billings, and I got the job about 2 weeks before the semester started, so I had very, very little time to prepare. And the first assignment that I gave was to ask people to do a podcast, and I sent them to a particular site that was allowing people to upload their podcasts. But after I wrote that assignment, the site stopped receiving submissions, like within hours of me posting this. And some students were rather unforgiving about this. They thought, well, gee whiz, he doesn't have his act together. He didn't check to see whether or not they were taking submissions, when in fact I had. But things changed in the meanwhile. And so then I was left with this hang up. Oh man, I just ruined my rapport with students in the very first assignment, and now I look like a fool. So that's something I think that I'll probably struggle with for my entire teaching career, because I have a bit of a perfectionist bent to me anyway. And I just want to encourage you as teachers, as counselors in your fields, to not expect perfection of yourselves, and also to not expect perfection of your students. It works both ways. And I think it's really important for us to be human in front of our students. And I think that this helps students engage with us more, and I think it helps students trust us more. And that word trust brings me to a review of our discussion board forums that we had this past week. If you'll notice, I made hardly any comments on the discussion board this week. They're pretty much entirely in Taylor's hands. Thank God for Taylor. She's been pushing you. She's been asking you questions like, what would you do in your class with this information? She's been telling you just bluntly to dive deeper into this topic. And that's the kind of thing that I want her to do. That's the type of thing that I try to do with you. It's not meant to be pushy, but it is meant to push you, just in a polite way, to engage your thinking at a deeper and deeper level, and to generate some of those higher level cognitive processes that we see in Bloom's taxonomy, like synthesis and evaluation and analysis and creation. So thank you, Taylor, publicly, for managing the discussion boards this week. I was just incredibly impressed. I can't say that over and over enough. So back to this word trust. You know, I trusted Taylor to go ahead and do the discussion boards. And the word trust came up specifically in a thread that Danielle had posted in the bias conversation. And that word struck out to me because it seems to me that trust and bias are related. What is it that trust is? Somebody told me many years ago that trust requires two things. The first thing is that trust requires you to think that the other person is competent. So you must believe that the other person has the ability to carry out whatever it is that needs to be done. The other element of trust is that you have to believe that person has your best interest in mind. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're going to the doctor. You have a problem. You're not going to trust a doctor who really wants to help you, has your best interests in mind, but has never been to medical school. You're also not going to trust a doctor that has all of the best credentials in the world, but doesn't appear concerned about your welfare. In other words, their ego gets in the way or something else gets in the way. So these two elements of trust, competence and the belief that the other person has your best interest in mind, are related to this issue of safety, which also comes up in the conversation of bias. So all of this to say, when we keep track of our bias, when we address our bias, what we're doing is helping to create a safe learning environment. And that's something I can't underscore enough in terms of importance. I mentioned earlier that last semester I kind of ruined my rapport with students right off the bat because of an assignment that didn't go well. So how did that make me look? That made me look incompetent, right? So I lost some trust right out of the get-go. And there were several students I could tell at my end of course evaluations that I had never earned their trust back. I lost it the first week. And then from that point on, no matter what I did, if it was stellar, in my mind, there would still be the imperfections that people would pick out and say, oh, you know, this just adds to my initial belief that this person is incompetent. So you can see how all of these things are related in terms of creating a safe learning environment and in terms of establishing rapport and respect for your students. There were a couple of things I was surprised about in the research that folks generated in regard to this thread on bias, and I want to put out something a little bit cautionary here. I think it was Tier, I believe, that had found a piece of research that mentioned that students are more likely to leave positive feedback than negative feedback. Now, that research study, if I'm not mistaken, was based off of a study of eBay seller comments. And it was not a meta study. In other words, it was not a study that reviewed other studies. So we're just looking at one particular study that mentioned that eBay buyers are more likely to leave positive feedback than negative feedback. So does that translate into the education environment? I'm not sure. I didn't see any piece of research that said, okay, and now this translate into the educational environment. So just a bit of a caution there when we take one piece of research, not to generalize that to all fields or to all environments. However, it is something interesting to keep in mind. The other topic that we had up was technology. And probably the most salient points that I could find in regard to technology were issues of equity. And there are many different kinds of equity, right? We have age equity in terms of technological issues. We tend to think of the older generations as not being as technologically competent as, say, the younger generations. I experienced this myself with my nieces and nephews. I look at the things that they can do and I say, wow, you are going to be light years ahead of where I am at this point in my life when you reach this point in my life. And so this goes to the topic of bias, right? Because we could think just based off of a person's age that they should or might not have a particular amount of technological competency. These are generalizations, and we just can't apply generalizations to all students across the board. So that's another place where we can check ourselves. Another equity issue had to do with access, just in general, and also access in terms of folks that have exceptionalities, particular disabilities or different ways of learning. There are some things that in the state of Montana are perhaps we are more acutely aware of than we might be aware of in a different state, and that's based on our geography and just the ability to have internet access. I'm struggling with who it was that opened this thread. It might have been Christy that was talking about Indian reservations. No, maybe it was Jen, actually. Now, see, this is a blooper. I would normally edit this out, go see who it was, and then come back and appear as though I'm perfect, right? So at any rate, I'm struggling to remember right off the top of my head who it was that opened up this conversation about being on an Indian reservation and folks not necessarily having all of the access to the internet that you might have, say, if you live in downtown Billings. You don't necessarily have to live on an Indian reservation to not have very good internet access. I found that out when I had moved here and was looking at places to live, and I actually chose where I live currently based on internet access because I knew that I needed to have internet access where I lived. Not everybody has that luxury of being able to say, well, I don't necessarily want to live here because I can't get the internet. These are important issues for us to consider when we're teaching online for a variety of obvious reasons. And I want to point out one of the reasons that, at least to me, wasn't so obvious when it comes to access and geography, and that is simply opportunity. We don't necessarily think about folks' needs compared to their opportunities. But this whole issue of technological ability, tech issues, is tied to this topic of opportunity. Not everybody has the same opportunity. So if I can kind of summarize the entire tech thread in one word, that word would be opportunity. So when designing courses, when taking courses, when helping students through courses, we have to keep in mind this question: what opportunities does this student have in the first place? Cheryl mentioned that she helps some students take particular math classes and that they sign up for online class, but are doing so sometimes without having any internet access at all after they leave the campus. And the question is, well, why would you do that? And the answer is, well, because that's the class I need. So that's the opportunity that I have, and now I'm kind of stuck in this position where I'm in an online class, and the only opportunity that I have to be online is if I drive to Billings or drive to somebody else's house who has internet access. So opportunity, keep that at the forefront of your mind when designing instruction and when even selecting your own courses in the future. There were a couple other things that I wanted to point out in the tech thread just as themes that showed up. There was a research study that was pointed out by CAP from 2003, that's K-A-P-P. Several issues, accessibility, which I already mentioned, and modularity. But usability, compatibility, maintainability were the other big three. So this, for example, maintainability, compatibility, this has to go with things like relearning new software, applications, new hardware. It seems like every time we master something, something else comes out that's better, supposedly, unless we're talking about Windows 8. Or at least gets replaced by another fad. It might not necessarily be better, but it is more popular, so then more people want to try it because it's the popular thing to do. So that maintainability and compatibility and usability issue is extremely important as well when it comes to technology, which brings us to one of our other main conclusions from the tech issues thread, which is that difficulty is inevitable. So whose fault is that? Is that my fault? Is that your fault? Is it the computer's fault? Do I need to find some party to blame for difficulty? No, not necessarily. I think for myself, what this entire conversation about difficulty being inevitable points out is that I need to be flexible with my students. And that's what I'm hoping that you're going to pick up as well. Not just this conversation that we had about opportunity, but this topic of flexibility and thinking the best of students, giving them the benefit of the doubt is extremely important as well. The other thread that we had up was a thread about cheating. And one of the most interesting things that I found from this thread was that the way we teach can actually encourage cheating. I'd never thought about that before. And it's salient. The way that I teach, the way that I assess, could actually encourage people to cheat. So if you're interested in that thought, go to the threads about cheating and read through those. Because it's fascinating that by trying to do something right, we could actually end up doing something wrong. All the best intentions of mice and men. It's just worth pondering it. I'm going to be thinking about that for quite some time, I can guarantee you. There were a couple of other things that were mentioned in the cheating thread that actually go back to the issue of trust. One of those is making the teacher real, and developing the rapport with students is important in terms of them not wanting to cheat. Essentially, the argument goes like this. If I like you as an instructor, I'm going to be less likely to cheat on your assessments. It makes sense to me, just intuitively. I'm curious if it makes sense to you as well. Finally, and I could have started with this, but I'll end with this because I think it's a good thought just to land on, is this question of what is cheating? Is cheating just plagiarism? Is cheating just copying off of somebody else's work? Or are there other more nuanced aspects of cheating, like retaking an assessment? That maybe your teacher wouldn't be able to tell that you retook that assessment. Having somebody else take an assessment for you, validating the identity of an online learner, using resources other than the resources that the instructor tells you that you're allowed to use? These are all just different nuances of this cheating conversation that we can consider. And there are some really interesting things that people were talking about in terms of ameliorating cheating. One of those was, in terms of the identity issue, having students take a picture of themselves holding up their work and then submitting that. I'm not sure if that gets around the issue of cheating, because I could have just had somebody else do the work and then take the work and hold it up and claim it's mine. Another one was having students sign an academic dishonesty policy or rewrite an academic dishonesty policy in their own writing. Continually reminding students about academic dishonesty policies. Proctoring students so that they are not violating academic dishonesty policies. These are all very tricky, and they can also be expensive, especially the proctoring part. There was a thread comment about a nursing student exam where students were required to be videotaped while they were taking their assessments, and one of the comments was how incredibly nerve-wracking that must be, especially when we're talking about people that, you know, I have test anxiety. I'm not sure how many other people have test anxiety, but it's fairly common. How much are we exacerbating the anxiety when we're asking that student to be proctored or videotaped while they're taking their assessment? And do we really need to do that in the first place? How much trust should we just give out without it being earned? So this is a part where we reflect on ourselves as individuals and people with personalities. You know, is my personality such that I generally trust people right out of the gate until they find a way to lose my trust? Or am I somebody who doesn't trust anybody, and you have to earn my trust? It's going to change the way you teach, and it's going to change the way you assess. And if you haven't thought about this question, then think about it now, because it is going to impact your practice, especially in terms of that safe learning environment. So to wrap up this entire week, I'll leave you with the big question of, why do we assess in the first place? What's the purpose? Because I need to put a grade down on a piece of paper? Or because somehow that assessment is going to help the student improve the outcome? Why do we assess in the first place? And should we be assessing? Last thought for video recap. Please go to the office hours thread. Liz has started a thread regarding something I mentioned last week, which is, should we or should we not evaluate each other? In other words, should you take the rubric that was generated for discussion board contributions and evaluate one of your peers? And if we do that, how will we do that? What will that look like? What will the ground rules be? I want to know what people think about that. I personally say in my reply to Liz that I find great value in peer evaluations. I know many of my colleagues do as well. It is tricky though, and it can be messy. And once again, I leave you with that question of, why would we do that in the first place? Because you need a grade? Or because somehow you evaluating your peer is going to help your peer improve their outcome in the future? So I'll see you on the office hours thread. That was the video recap for week 4. So from Scottsdale, Arizona, this is Jeremiah Compton G for EDCI 575, and I'll be releasing the new course material later on today. Thanks, everybody.